At the break of dawn, a poor rancher was about to learn that sharing bread with a stranger could stir the wrath of 1,000 horses. In the vast, unforgiving expanse of the American West, where the sun painted the rugged mountains in hues of gold and crimson, George Tatum lived a solitary life on the outskirts of a dying town. The wind howled through the crevices of his weathered cabin, a constant reminder of the heartache and solitude that clung to him like dust on the cattle he once tended. George was a man shaped by tragedy, a former lawman turned recluse, haunted by the ghosts of choices made under duress, a past that left him scarred and weary. As he rose with the sun, the faint smell of campfire smoke wafted through the cool morning air, and he instinctively reached for his rifle, a habit born from years of watching for trouble. The land stretched endlessly around him, a harsh reminder of both his isolation and his independence. He'd learned to survive on his own, with only the whispers of the wind and the occasional rustle of wildlife for company. Yet, despite his self-imposed exile, a flicker of kindness remained buried deep within him, waiting for the right moment to ignite. Just as the first rays of sunlight crested the horizon, illuminating the landscape with a soft golden light, a shadow appeared on the dirt path leading to his home. George squinted, heart racing as he caught sight of 3 figures emerging from the haze. They were Native Americans, 2 men and a woman, their clothes tattered and worn, their faces etched with exhaustion and fear. The rancher felt a surge of protectiveness mixed with an instinctive caution, a reflex honed by years of living on the edge of conflict. As they approached, it became evident that they were fleeing something far worse than mere hunger or hardship. The desperation in their eyes spoke of a threat so pervasive, it sent chills down George's spine. The men reached his fence, their hands raised in a gesture of peace. The woman, clutching a small bundle to her chest, fell to her knees, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. George stood frozen, wrestling with the tumult of emotions churning within him. To help them would mean risking everything he had, his life, his land, and the fragile peace he had carved out in this harsh wilderness. Yet the sight of their suffering ignited a spark of compassion, a reminder of the humanity he had fought so hard to preserve within himself. "Please," the older man pleaded, his voice hoarse and trembling. "We are not your enemy. We seek only refuge." With the sun rising higher, casting long shadows across the ground, George was faced with a choice that weighed heavy on his heart. He could turn them away, dismiss their plight and retreat back into the safety of his isolation, a decision that would echo the prejudices of a society that had long viewed Native Americans as less than human. Or he could open his door and risk everything to offer them shelter and sustenance, a choice that could cost him dearly but might also restore a part of his own fractured spirit. As he hesitated, a haunting melody drifted through his memory. His father's words spoken long ago, "A man's worth is measured not by what he has, but by what he is willing to give." The rancher felt the weight of those words pressing down on him, urging him toward the path of righteousness, even as the threat of the outside world loomed large. Finally, George made his decision. He lowered his rifle, his heart pounding in his chest as he called out to them, "Come on in. You're safe here for now." The relief that washed over the 3 strangers was palpable, their faces transforming from despair to gratitude. As they stepped inside his cabin, George's mind raced with the implications of his choice. Little did he know, the forces that hunted them were already closing in, dark clouds gathering on the horizon. In the town nearby, a man named Sheriff Clayton Rourke was stirring trouble. A corrupt lawman with an iron grip on the small community, Rourke thrived on the suffering of others, exploiting racial tensions to maintain his power. He'd heard whispers of a band of Native Americans seen fleeing across the plains, and he was determined to track them down. The sheriff's eyes glinted with greed as he imagined the rewards for bringing them in, both in terms of silver and the sweet taste of control over a fearful populace. As George prepared a meager meal for his unexpected guests, he couldn't shake the feeling that his simple act of kindness had set in motion a series of events he could not fully comprehend. The weight of the world felt heavier on his shoulders, but he was resolute. He would protect these strangers if only for a little while, even as the shadow of Rourke's intentions darkened the horizon. The sun climbed higher, its fierce light illuminating the dusty landscape and casting a long shadow over George's small cabin. He could hear the distant rumble of horses, a sound that sent a shiver down his spine. 400 horsemen lined his fence, he thought, a metaphorical warning ringing true as the reality of the situation began to take shape in his mind. He could either face the storm brewing outside or turn back to the life of solitude he had fought so hard to maintain. As the 3 Native Americans shared in the bread he offered, the path ahead became clearer, though no less perilous. Little did George know that the choices he made in the coming days would not only determine his own fate, but would also challenge the very essence of justice and humanity in a world torn apart by prejudice and greed. The distant rumble of hooves grew louder, echoing like the beating of a war drum in George's ears. He had seen Rorke's men before, a gang of ruthless riders who preyed upon the weak, and now they were coming for him and the 3 souls he had taken in. The day wore on, the sun relentless in its ascent. As George paced the small confines of his cabin, he could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. The 3 Native Americans huddled close, their faces a mixture of fear and resolve. They spoke softly among themselves in a language George could not understand, but the urgency in their tone was unmistakable. He wished he could ease their minds, but he was wrestling with his own demons, memories of loss that haunted him like the specters of the past. As the shadows stretched across the land, the sound of the approaching horsemen morphed from a distant threat into a looming reality. With each passing moment, George could feel the weight of his decision pressing down on him like the sweltering heat of the afternoon sun. He had extended his hand in kindness, but now he could feel the threat of Rorke's looming presence like a predator scenting its prey. He approached the trio, their eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and trepidation. "We need to prepare," he said, his voice steady, but his heart racing. They looked to him, and for a brief moment he felt a flicker of connection, a shared understanding of the risks they faced. One of the Native Americans, a young man with fierce determination etched upon his face, stepped forward. "We have fought many battles," he said, his voice strong despite the uncertainty surrounding them. "Your kindness will not be forgotten, but we cannot hide forever." George nodded, recognizing the fire of resilience in the young man's spirit. "If we face them, it won't be with guns alone. We need to think this through. Rorke is more than just a man. He's a system that thrives on fear. We must outsmart him." The 3 exchanged glances, their expressions shifting as they contemplated George's words. They were warriors in their own right, accustomed to fighting for survival, yet this was different. The stakes were higher, the adversary more cunning. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm golden light across the rugged landscape, the rumble of hooves reached a deafening crescendo. George peered out of the cabin, and there they were, silhouetted against the dying light, a dark wave of men on horseback, their faces hard and unyielding, ready for violence. Rorke's voice cut through the murmur of the night as he shouted orders to his men, his tone dripping with contempt. "We know you're in there, rancher. Hand over the savages and this can end peacefully." George clenched his fists. There was no peace to be found in Rorke's vision, only the relentless pursuit of power. He turned to the Native Americans, their faces set with determination. "We can't let him divide us. We stand together or we fall apart." In that moment, an unexpected alliance was forged, a coalition of the dispossessed and the reluctant protector, bound by a common purpose. They would not confront Rorke's men with weapons alone, but with the truth they would unveil together. As the night descended and the stars began to twinkle overhead, George formulated a plan. They would use the terrain to their advantage, employing the element of surprise and cunning to expose Rorke's true nature. The corrupt man had underestimated not just the strength of one man, but the power of unity against tyranny. The tension thickened in the air, but so did the resolve in George's heart. The time had come to act, not just for survival, but for justice. As he looked at the 3 Native Americans, he saw more than strangers. He saw the strength of their shared struggle, the fight against a common enemy, and in that moment he knew he would not waver. With the enemy closing in, the stakes could not have been higher, but George felt alive for the first time in years. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the promise of a storm, one that would change everything. He would face Rorke and his men, not just as a rancher, but as a guardian of what was right. The fight for justice had begun, and with it, the spark of hope ignited in a world so desperately in need of it. As dawn broke over the rugged horizon, the sun cast long shadows across the valley, illuminating the dust that hung in the air like a shroud. George stood at the edge of his property, flanked by his newfound allies, the 3 Native Americans. Their faces were etched with a mix of resolve and fear, reflecting the gravity of the moment that lay ahead. The distant thunder of hooves echoed through the canyon, a steady drumbeat that quickened George's pulse. He could see them now, a dark wave of horsemen cresting the hill, their numbers far greater than he had anticipated. Rourke had come to collect on his threats, and with him rode the very embodiment of a corrupt system that thrived on fear and division. George's heart raced, but as he glanced at the Native Americans beside him, he felt a calm wash over him. They exchanged looks of determination, each nodding slightly, a silent agreement forged in the crucible of adversity. This was not just his fight, it was theirs too. United against a common foe, they would stand firm. "Remember," George said, his voice steady despite the chaos approaching, "we're not just defending this land. We're here to show them that justice can't be bought or sold. Let's draw them into the ravine. We can use the boulders for cover." As the horsemen drew closer, George could make out the sneering faces of Rourke's men, their expressions twisted with malice and greed. Each figure bore the weight of their leader's corruption, and George felt a swell of anger rise within him. He would not allow them to trample on the rights of others, nor would he let them extinguish the flicker of hope he had ignited. The first line of horsemen thundered toward the ranch, kicking up dust that hung heavy in the air. Rourke, a towering figure at the head of the charge, raised a hand to signal the halt. His voice boomed, laced with mockery. "You think you can stand against us, old man? You and your ragtag band of savages? You're outnumbered and outmatched." George stepped forward, gripping the reins of his horse tightly, his jaw set. "You may have the numbers, Rourke, but you lack what truly matters, honor. We will stand for what's right, even if it means facing you here and now." The tension between them was palpable, a raw energy crackling in the air. Rourke's eyes narrowed, and for a moment George wondered if he had made a grave mistake. But then he remembered the strength that pulsed through the bond he had formed with the Native Americans, a strength that could not be measured by mere numbers. As the two sides stared each other down, a whisper of wind rustled through the grass, carrying with it the scent of rain, an omen of the storm to come. In that moment, a sudden realization struck George. This was not merely a confrontation, it was an opportunity to expose Rourke's true nature to the people who followed him blindly. "Let them come," George shouted, his voice ringing out like a battle cry. "Let them see the cowardice of a man who thrives on hate and fear. This isn't just about us, it's about the future of everyone in this territory. Stand with me, brothers and sisters. Show them what unity looks like." The 3 Native Americans moved forward, aligning themselves beside George, their faces a tapestry of courage. As the horsemen surged forward, a howl of defiance erupted from the small group standing firm against the tide. The winds began to pick up, swirling the dust and echoing the storm that brewed not just in the skies, but in the hearts of those who had been silenced for too long. In that moment, George understood the depth of his fight. It was not solely about the ranch or his past. It was about reclaiming dignity, about tearing down the walls that kept them apart. With the horsemen advancing, George called upon all the strength he had left, prepared to face the storm head-on, knowing that the truth would come to light, and with it, the chance for a new beginning. As the dust settled and the wind howled, George's heart raced, each beat a reminder of the stakes he had embraced. The thundering of hooves grew louder, a grim herald of Rourke's arrival. He could see the man's silhouette cutting through the haze, a figure draped in shadows and malice, flanked by men whose loyalty was bought with gold and fear. Rourke dismounted with a swagger that belied the danger he carried. His eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the scene, landing on George with a disdain that burned deeper than any gunshot wound. "You think you can stand against me, rancher?" he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think these savages will save you?" The 3 Native Americans stood resolute, their expressions a mix of defiance and resolve. George clenched his fists, the weight of the moment pressing heavily upon him. "They are not savages, Rourke. They are my allies in this fight for justice. It's you who exploits their suffering for your greed." Rourke let out a cruel laugh, a sound that echoed across the plains. "Justice? You think you can find justice in a land built on blood and betrayal? You're a fool, George, a well-meaning fool. And what of your past? You think they'll forget the lawman who turned his back on his own? In that instant, the words struck George like a bullet. Memories surged within him, ghosts of his former life as a lawman haunted by a tragic choice. Yet beneath the weight of his guilt, a flicker of resolve ignited. I have no intention of running from my past anymore, Rourke. This is where I make my stand. Suddenly, a second figure emerged from the shadows, someone George had never expected to see. It was Clara, a woman from the nearby settlement, her face etched with worry, but her spirit unbroken. "Rourke!" she shouted, stepping forward. "Your lies are crumbling. The people are waking up to your manipulation. They're not afraid anymore." The tension thickened, Rourke's expression shifting from arrogance to fury. "You think you can sway the crowd with your pretty words, Clara? You'll regret this." But before Rourke could respond, George felt a shift within himself. The truth about Rourke's operations in the territory was starting to unravel. "You've been lying to everyone, haven't you? Selling false promises while you drown this land in violence. But the people are starting to see through your veil." Rourke's eyes narrowed, revealing a flicker of panic. "What do you mean?" he hissed. "The stolen land, the disappearances," George pressed on, fueled by a newfound courage. "You've been working with corrupt officials, creating a narrative that pits us against each other while you sit back and profit from our chaos. We're not your pawns anymore." Rourke's facade cracked, revealing the desperation beneath. He stepped closer, eyes glinting with malice. "You think you can expose me? You're out of your depth, George. This is bigger than you. You have no idea what forces you're meddling with." But George stood firm, the weight of his convictions bolstering his resolve. "I know more than you think, Rourke. The truth is a powerful weapon, and it's time to arm ourselves with it." As the winds howled, gathering strength like the rising tide of change, George understood that this confrontation was just the beginning. The stakes were higher now, and the fight would not be won with guns, but with the truth, unraveling the web of deceit that Rourke had spun. He looked at Clara and the three Native Americans, a united front against the darkness. They had the strength to change their fate, and together they would stand against the storm. The revelation had ignited a fire within them, one that would not easily be extinguished. The wind howled around them, a tumultuous anthem to the brewing storm. George turned to Clara, her eyes reflecting both fear and determination. "We need a plan, Clara. Rourke will not sit idly while we gather evidence against him." She nodded, her spirit unyielding. "We can't fight him alone. We need allies who are willing to stand with us, people who know the truth of his schemes." "Then we'll ride at first light," George replied, resolute. "We'll reach the settlers in the valley, share what we've uncovered. If they see the truth, they'll have no choice but to stand against Rourke and his thugs." The three Native Americans stepped forward, their leader, a man named Tawa, voicing the unsaid. "We will ride with you. Our people have suffered under Rourke's lies and oppression. Together, we can rally more to our cause." As dawn broke, casting its golden hue over the rugged terrain, George felt the weight of responsibility pressing down upon him. The promise of a new day shimmered on the horizon, but the path ahead was fraught with peril. They mounted their horses, hearts pounding with the urgency of their mission. The ride through the valley was tense, each heartbeat echoing the fears and hopes of a fragile alliance. When they reached the settlers' encampment, George dismounted, a sense of foreboding creeping into his bones. He called out to the gathered crowd, familiar faces etched with uncertainty. "Listen to me," he shouted, his voice ringing out against the morning silence. "Rourke is deceiving you. He's pitting us against each other, all for his gain. We have proof, and together we can expose him." Murmurs swept through the crowd, doubt and skepticism swirling like dust in the wind. But Clara stepped forward, her voice steady. "You know me. You know our struggles. This isn't just a fight for our lives. It's a fight for our future." Tawa's presence commanded attention, his stoic demeanor lending weight to their words. "Together, we can stand against this tyranny. We must unite, not as enemies, but as people who seek justice." As George scanned the faces before him, he noticed the flicker of hope igniting in their eyes, but it was quickly doused by the arrival of a shadow. Rourke's men, armed and ready, riding hard to silence their defiance. The tension crackled in the air, and George felt the urgency of their mission intensifying. They had to act fast. "We need to gather evidence. Tawa, can you lead a few of your men to the east? We might find witnesses of Rourke's dealings. Clara, stay with me. We'll confront him and buy time for the others." The crowd began to shift, some stepping back in fear while others moved closer, emboldened by the resolve of the few. "This is it," George thought, feeling the weight of their hopes resting on his shoulders. "The truth is aflame and it's time to ignite it." As Rourke's men approached, the tension reached a boiling point. George locked eyes with Clara, a silent pact forming between them. They would stand their ground, ready to confront the darkness that loomed over them. The confrontation was imminent, and the truth hung in the balance, waiting to be unleashed. As the dust kicked up beneath the thundering hooves of Rourke's men, George's heart raced, each beat echoing the uncertainty of the moment. Clara stood beside him, her eyes fierce and unyielding, a mirror to his own resolve. The sound of the approaching riders resonated like the tolling of a bell, announcing not just the arrival of danger, but the test of their convictions. "Stay close," George murmured, his voice low but steady. He could sense the fear radiating from the crowd, but also the undercurrent of determination. They were ready to fight for their freedom, to stand together against an oppressive force that sought to crush them beneath its boot. Rourke's men, a motley crew of greed and malice, rode in, their faces hard and unforgiving. Rourke himself, a man whose very presence seemed to suck the light from the day, reined his horse to a halt at the front of the group. He was a figure of authority, cloaked in a false sense of righteousness, and his eyes narrowed as they locked onto George. "Look what the sun dragged in," Rourke sneered, his voice a jagged edge slicing through the tension. "A poor rancher playing hero. You think these people will stand with you? You're just a fool in a desert dreaming of rain." George stepped forward, his back straight, his breath steady. "These people are no fools, Rourke. They know the truth about your schemes, and I'm here to ensure it sees the light of day." Laughter erupted from the men behind Rourke, a sound devoid of mirth, echoing with threats. "And what do you plan to do, rancher? Speak your truth into the wind?" Rourke chuckled darkly, scanning the faces around him. "You're outnumbered and outclassed. I suggest you walk away while you still can." But George stood firm, the faces of those he fought for burning in his mind. "I'm not afraid of you or your men. The truth has a way of cutting deeper than any bullet. You think you can scare us into silence? You're mistaken." Clara shifted beside him, her voice rising in strength. "We are done living in fear, Rourke. Your reign of terror ends here. We've seen your cruelty and we will not bow to it." Rourke's expression darkened, his bravado faltering for a fleeting moment. He waved a hand dismissively, but the unease in his eyes betrayed him. "You think your words hold weight? You think these people will follow a madman?" Before George could respond, a rider broke away from Rourke's group, galloping towards the horizon. The urgency of that movement sent a ripple of anxiety through George. "What is he up to?" George wondered, instinctively drawing Clara closer to him. The rider reached the outskirts of the gathering, disappearing beyond the dunes, a messenger racing toward an uncertain fate. Was it a call for reinforcements? "Let them run," Rourke scoffed, regaining his composure. "You're wasting your time, rancher. They will return to their homes and you will be left here, alone and defeated." But George could feel the tide shifting. He turned his gaze to the crowd, their faces reflecting a mixture of fear and defiance. "They won't abandon us. Not now." In that moment of vulnerability, a flicker of hope ignited. He needed to act fast, to make Rourke understand that he had underestimated not just him, but the strength of the community he represented. "While you threaten us with violence, your own men may be plotting against you. Those who ride with you see the truth, Rourke. They know your greed blinds you to the real enemy." Rourke's eyes narrowed, suspicion creeping in as he scanned the faces of his own men. Perhaps they, too, were beginning to see the cracks in his facade. "Enough of this," Rourke spat, his patience wearing thin. "You're playing a dangerous game, rancher, but mark my words, I will not be the one to lose." As the tension thickened, George felt the weight of an alliance forming, a fragile bond that could either shatter or strengthen them in the face of impending violence. He knew they needed to expose Rourke's corruption, and time was running out. Moments stretched into eternity as George prepared for the confrontation that was about to unfold, aware that the truth would be their greatest weapon against the tyrant looming before them. With a deep breath, he steadied himself, ready to unleash the fire they all carried within. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty ground, George stepped forward, resolute in his purpose. "Rourke," he declared, "you've built your empire on lies and blood, but the truth is a powerful force and it cannot be silenced." With a slow, deliberate motion, he gestured toward the gathered Native Americans, their eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. "These people you seek to oppress aren't just shadows in your game. They are the heart of this land, the true stewards of its spirit. And today they stand with me." Rourke laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed against the canyon walls. "You think this ragtag group can stand against me? I hold the law in my hands." "Your law?" George shot back. "Your law is nothing but a tool for your greed. We've seen the way you twist justice, how you've turned neighbors into enemies for your own gain. But today that ends." The gathered men, emboldened by George's words, began to murmur among themselves, doubt creeping into Rourke's once unshakable grip. George had struck a nerve. "Let's expose your lies, Rourke," George pressed on. "Let's show everyone the truth behind your so-called authority." He turned to the Native Americans. "We must gather evidence, testimonies from those you've wronged. You can't silence the voices of the innocent. They will speak for themselves." A wave of uncertainty washed over Rourke as George's allies began to rally. One by one, the townsfolk began to step forward, their stories spilling forth like a river breaking free from a dam. Tales of deceit, of stolen land, of families torn apart by Rourke's relentless ambition. As the weight of their testimonies hung in the air, Rourke's bravado began to crumble. The alliance forged between George and the Native Americans was a bond stronger than any weapon. The truth was laid bare, and the community was no longer afraid. In a moment of desperation, Rourke turned to his men, but his words fell flat. They had seen too much. They knew now that the real enemy was not the people he painted as savages, but the man who had manipulated them for his own ends. As the sun set, casting a fiery glow across the landscape, Rourke found himself isolated, the weight of his corruption heavy upon him. The people he had once controlled began to walk away, leaving him to face the consequences of his actions alone. And in that moment, George felt a sense of justice settle over him like a warm blanket. Mercy isn't weakness, he thought, reflecting on the alliance they had built. It's a strength that binds us together in the face of adversity. As the dust settled and the voices of the community rose in unison, a new dawn broke over the land. The courage to stand together, to fight for what was right, had transformed them all. In the end, it was not just about defeating Rourke. It was about unearthing the truth, about forging bonds that had once seemed impossible. It was a testament to the resilience of humanity, a reminder that even in the harshest of landscapes, compassion and solidarity could thrive. And as George looked out over the land, he understood that this was not just a victory for one man, but for all who dared to challenge tyranny with the unwavering belief that justice would always prevail. In the heart of the Old West, under the vast and unforgiving sky, they had carved out a new beginning, one built on justice, mercy, and the indomitable spirit of courage. As the stars began to twinkle above, George whispered to himself, "What will you fight for when the world tests your heart?"